Some nights don't change your life because of what you do. They change it because of who walks through the door. Rain had been falling over rural Pennsylvania for almost 6 hours without a break, turning the empty highway into a ribbon of blurred headlights and black reflections. The faded neon vacancy sign outside Cedar Pines Motel buzzed every few seconds, flickering between red and darkness as if it couldn't decide whether anyone should stop there at all. Inside the tiny front office, Tessa Morgan's the old clock mounted above the coffee machine. 2:13 a.m. The sound of the second hand seemed louder than the storm. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for the motel ledger. Night shifts had become her normal ever since her father suffered a stroke 8 months earlier. Medical bills had replaced family dinners. College had quietly become a dream postponed. Every Thursday through Sunday, she worked alone from sunset until sunrise while the owner slept in the apartment upstairs, trusting her to handle the handful of travelers who occasionally wandered off Interstate 80. Most nights were painfully ordinary. A truck driver needing coffee, a couple arguing over directions, someone asking if the Wi-Fi actually worked. Tonight had been different from the moment the rain began. The parking lot had remained completely empty for more than 3 hours. Even the vending machine outside had stopped humming. The silence carried a strange weight, pressing against the windows harder than the rain itself. Tessa looked toward the security monitor mounted beside the reception desk. 4 grainy black and white camera feeds showed the deserted parking lot, the narrow hallway, the stairwell and the back entrance. Nothing moved except sheets of rain sweeping across the pavement. She let out a slow breath and returned to organizing room keys by habit more than necessity. Her fingers paused over room 12. The brass key carried scratches from decades of use. It had become almost a joke among regular guests. The heater rattled, the bathroom faucet leaked. The television only played half the channels. Nobody ever requested it twice. Thunder rolled across the hills. The lights dimmed for one heartbeat before returning. Tessa instinctively looked toward the front door, still nothing. She poured herself another cup of burnt motel coffee that tasted more like warm bitterness than caffeine. Outside, wind pushed fallen branches across the entrance road. The weather report had warned everyone to stay home, and for once people had actually listened. What she didn't know was that less than a mile away, 3 black SUVs had already left the highway without their headlights. They disappeared into the trees one after another, swallowed by the rain before any passing driver could notice them. Back inside the motel, Tessa found herself reading the same magazine page for the 4th time. She wasn't actually reading, she was listening. Old buildings developed their own language after midnight. Pipes clicked, wood settled, ice machines groaned. Usually those sounds felt familiar. Tonight every creak seemed slightly out of place. A sudden knock shattered the silence, just once, firm, controlled, not impatient. Her eyes lifted immediately toward the glass entrance. A tall figure stood beneath the flickering neon light. Rain streamed from a dark overcoat onto the concrete sidewalk. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of the awning, but something about the way he stood felt strangely still, as though the storm belonged to everyone else except him. Tessa hesitated only a second before unlocking the front door. Hospitality came before fear. That was the first lesson every motel clerk learned. Cold wind rushed inside as the stranger stepped across the threshold. Water dripped quietly from the edge of his coat, forming a small pool on the worn tile floor. He removed a pair of black leather gloves with deliberate movements and placed them on the counter beside a driver's license. No unnecessary gestures, no nervous glance around the room, no wasted words. "One room," he said calmly. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without asking twice. Tessa reached for the registration form while avoiding staring. He looked to be in his early 30s. Dark hair damp from the rain. A charcoal coat tailored too well for a roadside motel. A silver watch reflected the fluorescent lights for the briefest moment before disappearing beneath his sleeve. Nothing about him matched Cedar Pines. "Just one night?" she asked. "Until morning." She typed slowly into the aging computer. The reservation system took forever whenever storms interrupted the internet connection. His driver's license identified him as Adrian Bellini, Chicago, Illinois. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something kept her from relaxing. Maybe it was the silence. Most travelers apologized for arriving late. They complained about the weather. They joked about getting lost. This man simply waited. His eyes wandered once across the office before settling on the security monitor. He watched the grainy camera feeds for less than 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Tessa. "Is the motel full?" he asked. "No," she answered with an awkward smile. "You're actually our only guest tonight." For the first time since entering, the stranger's expression changed almost invisibly. Not relief, not satisfaction, recognition, as though that answer confirmed something he had already expected. He accepted the brass key for room 12 without looking at the number. Behind him, lightning illuminated the parking lot through the glass entrance. For one frozen instant, another pair of headlights appeared beyond the rain and then vanished again into darkness. The taillights disappeared almost as quickly as they had appeared, leaving nothing behind except rain and the uneasy feeling that the darkness outside had been watching the motel instead of passing by. Tessa Morgan forced herself to look away from the glass door and finish the registration receipt with steady hands. "Breakfast starts at 6, she said, sliding the room key across the counter. "The coffee is free, even if it is not very good." The corner of Adrian Bellini's mouth lifted ever so slightly, but it softened the sharp edges of an otherwise unreadable face. "Thank you," he replied before picking up the brass key. He turned toward the hallway without another question. His footsteps measured and almost silent against the old wooden floor. Tessa watched him disappear around the corner leading to room 12. Only after he was gone did she realize the front office suddenly felt colder than before. She locked the entrance again, checked the deadbolt twice out of habit, then glanced back at the security monitor. The hallway camera showed Adrian stopping outside his room. Instead of opening the door immediately, he stood perfectly still for several seconds. His eyes moved once toward the emergency exit at the end of the corridor, then toward the parking lot through the narrow window beside the ice machine. Only then did he unlock the room and quietly step inside. The screen returned to stillness. Tessa told herself he was simply a cautious traveler. Plenty of people checked their surroundings before settling into unfamiliar places. There was nothing unusual about that. Still, she could not ignore the strange calm he carried with him. Most guests arrived exhausted from long drives. He had arrived looking as though exhaustion had never been allowed to reach him. Outside, the rain intensified. Water streamed across the parking lot in silver ribbons beneath the flickering lights. The old oak tree near the motel sign bent under another powerful gust of wind. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills again. She picked up the motel phone to call the owner upstairs, thinking perhaps someone else should be awake on a night like this. Halfway through dialing, she stopped. He had worked nearly 16 hours repairing broken plumbing before finally going to bed. Waking him because of a feeling she could not explain seemed unreasonable. She quietly returned the receiver to its cradle. What she did not know was that the same black SUVs had parked along an abandoned service road less than half a mile away. Their engines had gone silent, their headlights remained dark. From that distance, Cedar Pines Motel was little more than a faint glow beyond the rain. Back inside, the clock reached 2:31 in the morning. Tessa opened the ledger again, hoping paperwork would distract her mind. The pages listed years of forgotten travelers, handwritten signatures, and faded memories belonging to strangers who had never expected anyone to remember their names. Adrian Bellini's signature looked different from the others, clean, precise, every letter carefully formed. It almost looked practiced. Another sound interrupted her thoughts. Not a knock this time, a vehicle. She looked toward the parking lot monitor. An aging pickup truck slowly entered the lot before stopping beneath the nearest light. The driver remained inside for almost a full minute. Windshield wipers continued sweeping back and forth. Finally, the truck reversed, turned around, and drove back toward the highway without anyone stepping outside. Tessa frowned. Travelers often changed their minds, but something about the hesitation unsettled her. She replayed the camera feed in her mind. Had the driver looked toward room 12 before leaving? She could not be certain. The motel suddenly felt much larger than usual. Every empty room seemed to hold its own silence. Every hallway stretched farther than she remembered. She grabbed a flashlight from beneath the counter and decided to perform her routine inspection earlier than usual. She walked slowly through the hallway, checking each emergency exit and making sure every window remained locked against the storm. The building creaked softly around her. When she reached room 12, she paused without intending to. Light shone beneath the door. She could hear nothing from inside. No television, no footsteps, no running water, just silence. As she turned to continue down the hallway, the room door opened. Adrian stood there, now wearing a dark sweater instead of the rain-soaked coat. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Tessa felt slightly embarrassed. "Just checking the building. The weather gets rough around here." His gaze drifted briefly toward the hallway window. Storms are not always the most dangerous thing traveling at night. Before she could ask what he meant, the lights throughout the motel blinked once, twice, and then everything went completely dark. Somewhere beyond the walls, another engine quietly entered the parking lot, unseen beneath the cover of rain. Darkness has a way of making ordinary places confess their secrets. For one endless second, Cedar Pines Motel vanished. The buzzing lights, the faded hallway, the old vending machine, even the steady glow beneath room 12 dissolved into complete blackness. Only the rain remained, drumming against the roof with patient determination. Tessa Morgan froze where she stood, one hand still wrapped around the flashlight she had barely remembered to switch on. Its narrow beam cut through the hallway, revealing floating dust and peeling wallpaper, but little else. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a floorboard creaked. She instinctively looked toward Adrian Bellini. He had not stepped backward into his room. Instead, he remained standing in the doorway, his attention fixed beyond her shoulder toward the motel entrance. He did not appear frightened. He appeared focused. The emergency lights finally flickered to life, washing the hallway in a dim red glow that made every shadow look deeper than before. "Power outages happen during storms," Tessa said, almost to reassure herself. Adrian gave a slight nod, but his eyes never left the far end of the hallway. "Does the backup generator work?" he asked quietly. "Usually." She hesitated before adding eventually. Almost as if the building had heard her, the generator coughed once somewhere behind the office, then fell silent again. Another heavy silence settled over the motel. Tessa forced a small smile that did not feel convincing. "I should check the electrical room." "You should not go alone," Adrian replied. His voice remained calm, neither demanding nor dramatic. It sounded like simple advice. She almost laughed. "It is only an old generator." He looked toward the front office again before answering. "Sometimes people notice when the lights go out." The words lingered longer than she expected. Before she could ask what he meant, the motel phone began ringing. The shrill sound echoed through the empty building, startling both of them. Tessa hurried back toward the reception desk while Adrian quietly followed several steps behind, without saying another word. She picked up the receiver. Nothing, no greeting, no breathing, only a faint layer of static beneath the sound of distant rain. "Hello," she repeated. The line remained silent, then it disconnected. She slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. "Wrong number?" Adrian asked. She did not believe it. The security monitor remained dark because of the power interruption, leaving the front windows as the only way to see outside. Rain blurred everything beyond the glass into shifting grey shapes. Tessa unlocked the drawer beneath the counter and removed a battery-powered lantern. Warm yellow light filled the office, pushing back the red emergency glow. For a brief moment, the motel almost felt normal again. Then headlights swept across the front windows. Both of them turned at the same time. A dark SUV rolled slowly through the parking lot without stopping. It continued toward the far end of the property before disappearing behind the line of trees beyond the last row of rooms. Tessa frowned. Maybe they are looking for a place to stay. Adrian watched the empty driveway for another few seconds. Maybe. The answer sounded unconvinced. She noticed something then. His overnight bag still rested just inside room 12, exactly where he had left it. He had walked into the hallway without taking anything important with him. Either he trusted complete strangers unusually quickly, or he had never expected to leave his room for long. What she did not know was that another vehicle had quietly parked behind the abandoned gas station across the road. Its occupants remained inside, watching the motel through rain-covered windshields without moving. Back inside Cedar Pines, the generator finally roared to life. One by one, the hallway lights blinked back on. The front office brightened. The security monitor restarted with a burst of static before displaying the familiar camera feeds again. Tessa immediately checked the parking lot camera. Empty. She rewound the recording from the last several minutes, expecting to see the SUV pass through exactly as she remembered. Instead, the footage showed nothing except heavy rain blowing across vacant pavement. She replayed it again. Still nothing. Her heartbeat slowed just enough to become noticeable. "That cannot be right," she whispered. Adrian stepped closer to the monitor without invading her space. He studied the screen in silence. "Sometimes old systems miss frames during power failures," he said. It sounded reasonable, logical, yet the explanation did little to settle the uneasy feeling growing inside her. She looked back toward the glass entrance. Outside, the storm had begun to weaken, but the darkness somehow looked even deeper than before. Then a small movement caught her eye. Someone had placed a plain white envelope beneath the front door. Neither of them had heard footsteps. Neither of them had seen anyone approach the building. Tessa slowly walked toward it, stopping only inches away. Across the front, written in neat black ink, were 5 simple words: "For the guest in room 12. She looked up at Adrian. For the first time since arriving at the motel, the calm expression on his face disappeared. The smallest changes often carried the greatest warnings. Tessa Morgan could not take her eyes off the white envelope resting against the bottom of the front door. Rainwater had soaked one corner, but the handwriting remained perfectly clear. For the guest in room 12. She looked from the envelope to Adrian Bellini. Only moments earlier, every movement he made had seemed deliberate and controlled. Now, for the first time since he had entered Cedar Pines Motel, a flicker of genuine concern crossed his face before disappearing almost instantly. He stepped forward without rushing. "Do not touch it yet," he said quietly. Tessa stopped with her hand only inches away from the paper. "Do you know who left it?" she asked. Adrian answered after a brief pause. "I know that whoever left it wanted to be seen without actually being seen." The answer raised more questions than it solved. She carefully crouched and studied the space beneath the door. Rainwater had blown inside, leaving a thin line of moisture across the tile floor, but there were no visible footprints outside. The parking lot remained empty beneath the flickering lights. She slowly unlocked the entrance and opened the door just wide enough to look outside. Cold air rushed into the lobby, carrying the smell of wet pine trees and fresh asphalt. Nothing moved except the rain. She looked left, then right. Every parking space stood empty. The highway beyond the motel had almost disappeared beneath the mist. Closing the door again, she picked up the envelope with 2 careful fingers and placed it on the reception counter. It felt surprisingly light. No bulky object, no unusual shape, just folded paper inside. Adrian remained silent. His attention briefly shifted toward the front windows before returning to the envelope. "Open it," he finally said. Tessa slid a letter opener beneath the flap and unfolded a single sheet of white paper. There were only 2 lines typed across the center. "We know where you stopped. Leave before sunrise." She read the words twice before looking up. "Is this some kind of joke?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the paper and examined it under the desk lamp. There was no signature, no logo, no fingerprints visible to the naked eye. He quietly returned it to the counter. "I do not think it was meant to frighten you," he said. "It was meant for me." Tessa folded her arms. "Then maybe you should tell me why someone is leaving at my workplace in the middle of the night." He looked toward the rain-covered parking lot again. "Because they expected me to keep driving, and you did not." "No." His calm honesty made the silence that followed feel even heavier. She searched his face for signs of deception but found none. He never looked away. He never became defensive. He simply refused to explain more than he believed necessary. What she did not know was that less than a mile away, 2 people sat inside one of the parked SUVs studying an old paper map spread across the dashboard. Cedar Pines Motel had been circled in black ink long before the storm began. Back inside, Tessa placed the letter inside the motel office drawer beside the registration book. She told herself she would call the sheriff after sunrise if nothing else happened. Until then, she needed facts instead of fear. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Adrian nodded. "Are you in trouble?" He considered the question carefully. "Someone believes I have something they want." "Do you?" Another pause. "No." The answer sounded truthful yet incomplete. Before she could press further, a loud metallic crash echoed from somewhere behind the building. Both of them turned immediately toward the rear hallway. Tessa grabbed the flashlight while Adrian instinctively stepped between her and the back exit without making it obvious. The beam swept across the narrow corridor leading toward the laundry room and supply shed. Everything appeared normal until another sharp clatter echoed outside. "Probably the trash dumpster," Tessa whispered. "The wind knocks it over sometimes." Adrian remained still for another few seconds before speaking. "Stay here," she frowned. "This is my motel." Exactly. Without waiting for permission, he walked toward the rear exit with slow, measured steps. Tessa hesitated only a moment before following several feet behind despite his warning. The back door opened onto a gravel service lane where rainwater rushed toward the drainage ditch. One of the large trash bins had indeed tipped onto its side. Cardboard boxes and empty plastic containers lay scattered across the wet pavement. It looked exactly like storm damage, almost. Adrian crouched beside the overturned container, his eyes settled on something half hidden beneath soaked cardboard. He picked up a small metal object, no larger than a house key. Tessa could not make out the engraving from where she stood. He quietly slipped it into his coat pocket before she could ask what it was. At that exact moment, a distant train whistle echoed through the valley. The sound carried across the rain with strange clarity. Adrian slowly looked toward the dark tree line beyond the motel property. Someone was standing there, too far away for Tessa to recognize, too still to be mistaken for a swaying branch. She blinked once, the figure was gone. When she looked back toward Adrian, his eyes remained fixed on the exact same spot, as though he had seen it too. The hardest part about seeing something impossible is convincing yourself that it really happened. Tessa Morgan kept staring toward the tree line long after the shadow had disappeared. The rain had begun to soften into a steady mist, revealing more of the forest beyond the motel than before, yet there was no trace of the motion she had witnessed only seconds earlier. Adrian Bellini remained equally still. His attention lingered on the darkness between the pines before he slowly turned back toward the overturned trash container. Whatever he had slipped into his coat pocket remained hidden. Tessa considered asking about it again, but stopped herself. Every answer he offered seemed to uncover two new questions. Together they returned to the warmth of the motel through the rear entrance. Water dripped from their shoes onto the worn linoleum floor as the old heater struggled against the cold air that had followed them inside. The building suddenly felt less like a workplace and more like a place waiting for something neither of them could predict. Tessa walked behind the reception desk and instinctively checked the security monitor. The cameras had resumed recording after the power outage. She scrolled back several minutes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious figure near the trees. The rear camera showed only rain sweeping across the service lane. The tree line remained perfectly empty. She rewound again. Nothing. It was as though the camera refused to acknowledge what human eyes had seen. Adrian quietly noticed the replay but offered no explanation. Instead, he picked up a folded tourist brochure advertising hiking trails around the county and casually spread it across the reception counter. His finger traced the surrounding roads without appearing to search for anything specific. Tessa recognized the map immediately. "You have been here before," she said. He looked up. "No." "Then why do you know where everything is?" A faint silence settled between them before he answered. "When someone spends enough time traveling, every small town begins to teach the same lessons." His response sounded thoughtful rather than evasive. Even so, she sensed he had deliberately avoided the real answer. Outside, another vehicle approached, this time slowing almost to a stop, before continuing along the highway without entering the property. Its headlights briefly swept across the lobby windows, washing the faded wallpaper in pale white light before disappearing again. Tessa watched until the road became empty once more. "Nobody ever drives this slowly," she whispered. Adrian said nothing. What she did not know was that less than 1 mile away, someone sitting inside a parked SUV quietly crossed Cedar Pines Motel off a handwritten checklist before circling another location farther east. The list contained only times and addresses, no names. Back inside the office, the motel telephone rang again. "Cedar Pines Motel. How may I help you?" This time there was breathing, slow, deliberate. Then a calm voice spoke only one sentence. "Tell your guest he still has time." The line disconnected before she could respond. She stared at the receiver for several seconds. Adrian did not ask what had been said. Somehow he already knew the call had been about him. "They called again," she said quietly. He nodded once. "Yes, you expected that. I expected they would keep trying." Frustration slowly replaced confusion. "Why are you still here?" He looked toward the rain-covered parking lot before answering. "Because leaving tonight would place other people in greater danger." It was the first answer he had given that sounded completely sincere. Tessa believed him, even though she still did not understand him. The clock above the coffee machine reached 3 o'clock in the morning. She poured 2 fresh cups from a newly brewed pot. The motel coffee remained just as terrible as before. Adrian accepted one with a quiet thank you. Steam drifted between them while the storm gradually weakened outside. For the first time since he had arrived, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt cautious, shared. Tessa noticed a thin scratch across the back of his right hand as he lifted the paper cup. It looked recent but superficial, the sort of mark someone might collect during an ordinary day without remembering how it happened. He caught her noticing it and simply adjusted his sleeve. No explanation, no dramatic gesture, just another quiet detail that refused to fit together. Then the old radio behind the reception desk crackled to life by itself after remaining silent for hours. Static filled the room before a weather bulletin interrupted with an emergency announcement. Flash flooding had closed the nearest interstate exit in both directions. Travelers were advised to remain where they were until sunrise. Tessa slowly lowered her coffee cup. Nobody was leaving Cedar Pines Motel anytime soon. Adrian glanced toward the front entrance as though calculating something invisible beyond the rain. Then, 3 slow knocks echoed against the glass door. Neither of them had seen anyone walk across the parking lot. Neither of them could see anyone standing outside now. Yet the knocks came again, calm and perfectly spaced, followed by complete silence. 3 quiet knocks could sound louder than a thunderstorm when there was nobody standing outside the door. Tessa Morgan felt every muscle in her body tighten as the sound echoed through the empty lobby. The glass entrance reflected only the warm light from inside the motel and the silver curtain of rain beyond it. No silhouette waited on the porch. No vehicle sat beneath the flickering neon sign. She looked at Adrian Bellini, expecting him to dismiss the noise as wind or loose metal. Instead, he calmly placed his untouched cup of coffee on the reception counter. "Stay behind the desk," he said. His voice remained level, but it carried an unmistakable certainty. Tessa did not argue. Adrian approached the entrance 1 measured step at a time, stopping just short of the glass. He studied the parking lot without touching the handle. The rain had weakened into a fine mist, revealing more of the empty asphalt than before. The old motel sign buzzed overhead, casting a faint red glow across puddles that mirrored the restless clouds. Another knock came. This time it sounded lower, almost as though it had come from the bottom half of the door instead of the center. Adrian slowly unlocked the deadbolt and opened the entrance only a few inches. Cold air slipped inside. The porch stood empty. He looked left toward the highway, then right toward the line of aging motel rooms. Nothing moved. His gaze finally dropped to the welcome mat. A small cardboard box rested there. It had not been there a second earlier. Tessa stepped closer despite herself. "Was that there before?" Adrian answered without taking his eyes off the box. "No." He crouched carefully, studying the plain brown package. No shipping label, no address, no return information. Only a strip of clear tape held it closed. He gently lifted it and carried it inside before locking the entrance again. The box weighed almost nothing. Tessa found herself holding her breath as he placed it on the counter beneath the desk lamp. "Should we call the sheriff?" she asked. Adrian looked at the package for another moment. "Not yet. You seem very certain, because if someone wanted to harm us, they would not need a cardboard box." His answer unsettled her for reasons she could not explain. He carefully opened the lid. Inside lay a simple motel keychain made of faded blue plastic. The metal tag read Room 8. Tessa frowned immediately. Adrian looked up. "Why? Room 8 has been closed for almost 2 years. She reached beneath the counter and removed the master ledger. The pages contained maintenance records dating back decades. She quickly found the entry. Room 8, water damage. Structural repairs postponed indefinitely. Do not rent. She closed the book slowly. "Nobody has stayed there since before my father got sick." Adrian turned the worn keychain over in his hand. On the back, scratched into the plastic with something sharp, were 3 small words. "Look beneath floorboards." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The heater hummed quietly in the background while the storm continued drifting east across the hills. Tessa finally broke the silence. "Someone wants us to go into that room." Adrian nodded once. "Or someone wants us to believe we should." What she did not know was that the abandoned Room 8 could be seen clearly through binoculars from a wooded ridge overlooking the motel. Whoever watched from that distance never looked toward the occupied rooms. Their attention remained fixed on the one room everyone believed had been forgotten. Tessa hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave the package alone until daylight, yet curiosity pushed against caution with surprising force. "I have the key," she admitted quietly. The owner never directly at her. "Then if we go together." The words were simple. There was no trace of command in them, only quiet resolve. For reasons she could not fully explain, Tessa trusted him more than she had trusted the anonymous phone calls, the disappearing vehicles, or even the motel cameras that refused to show what her own eyes had witnessed. She retrieved an old brass key from the cabinet behind the reception desk. Dust coated the tag. The number 8 had almost faded away. Together they walked down the silent hallway. The carpet softened their footsteps while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Room 8 waited near the far corner of the building, separated from the occupied rooms and an emergency exit. Cobwebs stretched across one side of the frame. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and old paint. Tessa inserted the key into the lock. It resisted at first before finally turning with a dry metallic click. She slowly pushed the door open. The room remained exactly as she remembered. Furniture covered with white sheets, curtains drawn shut. Dust floating through thin beams of light from the parking lot untouched. Then Adrian quietly raised one hand. "Listen." At first she heard nothing except the distant hum of the motel heater. Then it came again, a faint rhythmic tapping. Not inside the room, beneath it, as though something below the old wooden floor had been waiting for someone to arrive. Sometimes the truth does not announce itself with a scream. Sometimes it begins with a quiet sound beneath your feet. Tessa Morgan remained perfectly still inside the abandoned room, her eyes fixed on the old wooden floor. The tapping came again, slow, evenly spaced, almost mechanical. Adrian Bellini lowered himself onto one knee and pressed his fingertips lightly against one of the loose floorboards near the center of the room. The sound stopped immediately. Silence settled over the motel once more. Tessa found herself holding her breath without realizing it. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Adrian nodded. "Yes. What was it?" He looked around the neglected room before answering. "Not what I expected." He stood and slowly walked toward the window. Dust covered the glass so heavily that only blurred outlines of the parking lot remained visible. Outside, the storm had nearly passed. Thin clouds drifted apart, allowing pale moonlight to settle across the wet pavement. The motel looked peaceful again, too peaceful. Tessa stepped farther into the room. The furniture remained hidden beneath white sheets that had gathered years of dust. A small dresser leaned against one wall. The old television still sat on its stand exactly where she remembered it from childhood. Nothing suggested anyone had entered the room for years. Then her flashlight landed on the floor near the bed. Fresh footprints. She immediately crouched beside them. They had not been there before. The dust had been disturbed recently. Someone wearing heavy boots had crossed the room and stopped near the far corner before turning back toward the door. "These are new," she said quietly. Adrian joined her without speaking. He examined the marks for several moments, less than a day old. Tessa looked up in surprise. "How can you tell?" He gently brushed one footprint with the side of his hand. Fine dust lifted easily into the air. Older prints settled differently. It was another answer that sounded practiced rather than guessed. She realized she had stopped asking herself who Adrian really was. Instead, she had begun asking herself what kind of life had taught him to notice details no ordinary traveler would ever see. What she did not know was that the man watching from the wooded ridge quietly lowered his binoculars. A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing into the darkness. He reached for a handheld radio but did not press the transmit button. Not yet. Back inside room 8, Tessa remembered the message scratched into the motel keychain. "Look beneath floorboards." She slowly pulled the dusty rug away from the center of the room. The wooden planks underneath appeared almost identical except for one narrow section where the nails looked newer than the others. Adrian noticed it immediately. Together they carefully lifted the loose board using the claw end of an old hammer they found inside the maintenance closet next door. The wood came free with surprising ease. Beneath it rested a small metal lockbox wrapped inside thick waterproof plastic. Tessa stared at it in disbelief. Someone hid this here. Adrian remained silent as he carefully lifted the package from the narrow space beneath the floor. It was heavier than it looked. Years of dust had protected it from discovery. There was no lock. He slowly opened it, while Tessa held the flashlight steady. Inside were several neatly stacked documents, an old motel blueprint folded into thirds, and a small black flash drive sealed inside another plastic sleeve. Tessa looked confused. "What is all this?" Adrian unfolded the blueprint first. His eyes moved across it with growing concentration. Unlike the public layout hanging inside the office, this version showed an additional service tunnel beneath part of the motel foundation connecting the laundry room, the maintenance area, and an underground utility chamber that Tessa had never heard anyone mention. "This cannot be right," she whispered. "I grew up here. My father never said anything about a tunnel." Adrian carefully turned the blueprint toward her. One section had been marked with a red circle years ago. Next to it, someone had handwritten 3 words, "Emergency Access Route." Tessa felt the room grow strangely colder, despite the heater humming somewhere beyond the hallway. Why would an old roadside motel need something like that? Adrian looked at the blueprint for another long moment before folding it again. Because this building was not originally designed to be only a motel, it was the closest he had come to revealing anything significant since arriving. Before Tessa could ask another question, a sharp electronic tone echoed from inside Adrian's coat pocket. He removed a small satellite communicator no larger than a deck of cards. The screen displayed only one short message: "They found the motel. Evacuate immediately." Tessa looked from the screen to Adrian's face. His calm expression had not disappeared, but something deeper had changed behind his eyes. For the first time that night, he no longer looked like a traveler hiding from trouble. He looked like someone who had just realized the trouble had arrived first. The message on the small screen seemed to drain every remaining sound from the abandoned room. Tessa Morgan watched Adrian Bellini lower the satellite communicator without saying a word. The words had been brief, but they carried the weight of certainty. They found the motel. Evacuate immediately. She looked from the device to the weathered blueprint still resting in his hands. Who are they? She asked quietly. Adrian remained silent long enough for the question to become heavier. Finally, he folded the blueprint with deliberate care and slipped it back into the waterproof sleeve beside the flash drive. People who do not stop looking once they begin. It was not the answer she wanted, but for the first time she understood why every stranger, every unexplained message had seemed connected from the moment he arrived. This night had never been random. The motel had simply become the place where several invisible paths finally crossed. Tessa picked up the old lockbox. If this was hidden under the floor for years, someone wanted it to survive. Adrian nodded, which means someone else expected it to be found eventually. They quietly returned to the lobby carrying the documents. The hallway felt different now. The motel no longer seemed like an aging roadside business struggling through another rainy season. Every wall suddenly felt older than it appeared. Every creaking floorboard hinted at a history no guest had ever noticed. The faded family photographs hanging near the reception desk caught Tessa's attention. One picture showed the motel shortly after it opened decades earlier. She had passed it thousands of times without studying it. Tonight she stepped closer. The building looked almost identical, except for one detail. A small brick structure stood beside the laundry room in the old photograph. It no longer existed. That building is gone, she whispered. Adrian followed her gaze, probably connected to the tunnel. She carefully removed the picture frame from the wall. The back had never been opened since her father mounted it years ago. A folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the counter. She stared at the yellowed paper in surprise. The headline read, "County Emergency Shelter Opens Beneath Cedar Pines During Winter Storm Program." The article explained that decades earlier, before interstate highways rerouted traffic, the property had briefly served as a civil defense shelter equipped with underground utility corridors designed to protect travelers during severe weather. Funding disappeared within a few years. The tunnels were sealed. Most local residents eventually forgot they had ever existed. Tessa slowly lowered the newspaper. "My father never mentioned any of this." Adrian studied the clipping carefully. Perhaps he never knew. What she did not know was that the people searching for Adrian had never cared about the motel itself. They had been searching for the hidden tunnel network all along because someone believed a piece of evidence had disappeared there many years earlier. Back inside the office, Tessa connected the outdated motel computer. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared. No password, no encryption, only one video file and a scanned collection of handwritten documents. She clicked the first recording. Grainy security footage filled the monitor. The timestamp showed a date almost 20 years earlier. The motel lobby looked newer then. The furniture was different. The neon sign outside worked perfectly. A younger maintenance worker entered carrying a metal case identical to the one they had just discovered. He disappeared through a door beside the laundry room that no longer existed in the current building. The recording ended less than 30 seconds later. That passage really existed. Adrian leaned closer to the monitor. His expression remained calm, yet his eyes sharpened with recognition. Someone erased every official record except this one. Tessa opened the scanned documents next. They appeared to be handwritten maintenance logs from the motel's original owner. Most described ordinary repairs until the final pages. Several entries mentioned sealed storage beneath the property and repeated one sentence several times. "Never let outsiders discover the lower access." She looked toward Adrian. "Who counts as an outsider?" Before he could answer, the satellite communicator vibrated again. This time there was no written message, only a blinking location indicator. Adrian quietly switched off the device, but not before Tessa noticed the moving signal approaching their position. It was getting closer every few seconds. She looked through the front window. The rain had almost stopped. Dawn still remained more than 2 hours away. Across the highway, far beyond the motel sign, a pair of headlights slowly appeared through the thinning mist. They were not driving toward the interstate. They were turning into the old service road leading directly behind Cedar Pines Motel. The approaching headlights moved with unsettling patience, never speeding up, never drifting away, as though whoever was behind the wheel already knew exactly where the narrow service road ended. Tessa Morgan remained beside the reception window, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter, while the old computer monitor continued displaying the frozen image from the decades-old security recording. Everything that had seemed impossible only an hour earlier had become difficult to dismiss. The hidden tunnel, the forgotten shelter, the lockbox beneath the floor, none of it belonged to ghost stories or local legends anymore. Adrian Bellini quietly disconnected the flash drive and slipped it into the waterproof sleeve with the blueprint. "We should not leave these here," he said. Tessa nodded without hesitation. She no longer questioned every decision he made. She simply noticed that each choice seemed intended to prevent something rather than provoke it. The headlights disappeared behind the line of storage buildings at the rear of the property, hidden from the lobby windows. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of any engine. "Can they reach us from behind the motel?" she asked. Adrian unfolded the blueprint once more beneath the desk lamp. His finger stopped near the faded red circle marking the underground access route. If the original plans are accurate, there was another entrance near the maintenance building that no longer exists. Tessa looked toward the old family photograph still lying on the counter. The missing brick structure suddenly mattered far more than an old piece of local history. "If someone removed the building," she said slowly, "they probably wanted everyone to forget what was underneath it." Adrian looked at her with quiet approval. Exactly. What she did not know was that the people approaching Cedar Pines had spent years searching old property records across 3 states. The motel itself had never interested them. They believed something hidden beneath it could settle a betrayal that had divided powerful families decades earlier. Inside the office, the clock reached 3:48 in the morning. Dawn remained distant, but the storm clouds had begun breaking apart, allowing faint moonlight to spill across the empty parking lot. Tessa noticed another detail through the front window. The puddles no longer rippled. The wind had completely stopped. The stillness felt unnatural after hours of relentless rain. She remembered something from the newspaper clipping: emergency shelter. If travelers had once been directed underground during severe weather, there had to be another documented entrance somewhere on the property. She quickly searched through the scanned maintenance records again. Most pages listed plumbing repairs and electrical inspections until one handwritten note near the back caught her attention. "Replace furnace vent behind laundry room. Lower access concealed after inspection." She turned the monitor toward Adrian. "Behind the laundry room." He read the note only once before folding the blueprint. "That matches the original map." Together they walked toward the rear hallway, carrying only the flashlight, the blueprint, and the small lockbox. The motel seemed strangely alive despite the late hour. Pipes clicked softly inside the walls. The heater cycled on and off. Somewhere an ice machine released another batch of frozen cubes into its metal tray. Familiar sounds, ordinary sounds, yet every one of them now seemed capable of hiding something beneath it. The laundry room smelled faintly of detergent and old concrete. 2 aging washing machines stood against one wall beside a large utility sink. Tessa swept the flashlight across the room until the beam settled on an unusually wide metal ventilation grate near the floor, behind a stack of folded maintenance supplies. Dust covered most of it, except for one narrow edge where someone had recently brushed it clean. Adrian crouched beside the grate. The screws looked old, but one had fresh tool marks. He removed it carefully using a small screwdriver from the maintenance shelf. The remaining screws came free just as easily. Together they pulled the heavy grate aside. Cool air drifted upward from the darkness below. A narrow concrete staircase disappeared beneath the motel foundation. Tessa stared into the opening without speaking. She had spent countless nights working only a few feet away from this hidden passage without ever suspecting it existed. Adrian switched on the flashlight and directed the beam downward. Concrete walls stretched farther than the light could reach. Electrical conduit lined one side of the tunnel, untouched for decades. "It is real," Tessa whispered. Adrian nodded. "And someone expected us to find it tonight." Before either of them stepped onto the first stair, a distant sound echoed upward through the passage. It was not mechanical. It was not the building settling. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door closing somewhere deep beneath the motel, followed by complete silence. The echo of the closing metal door lingered beneath the motel long after the sound itself had disappeared. Tessa Morgan stood at the top of the hidden staircase, staring into the darkness below as cool air drifted upward through the narrow concrete passage. It smelled faintly of damp stone, old machinery, and decades of silence. Adrian Bellini adjusted the flashlight, sending a brighter beam down the stairs. The concrete walls reflected only fragments of light before disappearing into shadow again. "If someone closed that door," Tessa whispered, "then someone is already down there." Adrian listened for another moment before answering, "Or someone wanted us to believe they are." The distinction sounded small, but she understood why it mattered. Every message they had received that night had been designed to influence their decisions. Every clue had pushed them toward the next discovery without revealing who had arranged the path. She tightened her grip on the flashlight. "We have already come this far." Adrian gave a quiet nod. Together they descended the worn concrete steps. Each footstep produced a soft echo that traveled farther than either of them expected. The tunnel stretched beneath the motel in a straight line, reinforced by aging concrete supports spaced every 20 feet. Rusted electrical boxes clung to the walls beside faded emergency signs pointing toward exits that no longer existed. Tessa ran her fingers lightly across one wall. The concrete felt cold enough to hold memories. She had spent years walking above this hidden corridor without realizing an entirely different world rested beneath her feet. What she did not know was that the people searching the property had never entered the tunnel themselves. They had always believed someone else would unknowingly lead them to exactly where they needed to go. Nearly 100 yards ahead, the passage divided into two directions. The blueprint identified one branch leading toward the old maintenance building, while the second continued beneath the center of the motel. Adrian unfolded the map once more beneath the flashlight. A handwritten arrow pointed toward a room simply labeled Archive. "That was not on the public plans," he said quietly. Tessa noticed another detail. The handwritten ink matched the notes inside the maintenance journal. Whoever had hidden the lockbox had also updated the blueprint by hand. They followed the passage toward the marked location. The tunnel remained remarkably clean despite its age. There were no collapsed sections, no standing water, no signs of neglect. Instead, the place felt preserved, almost as though someone had quietly maintained it long after the county abandoned the shelter. The realization unsettled Tessa more than any anonymous phone call. Hidden places rarely remained hidden by accident. After another minute, the corridor opened into a small underground room lined with steel shelves. Dust covered most of the surfaces, but not all of them. One narrow path across the floor remained noticeably cleaner than the rest. Someone had walked here recently. Adrian slowly swept the flashlight across the shelves. Cardboard storage boxes sat untouched beside faded emergency blankets, battery-powered lanterns, first aid kits, and old county records stacked inside metal filing cabinets. The room looked less like a forgotten bunker and more like an archive frozen in time. Tessa carefully opened the nearest filing drawer. Hundreds of yellowed documents filled the folders. Most contained emergency planning reports and maintenance schedules. Then one thin envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, appeared a familiar surname, Bellini. She looked up at Adrian. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "That should not be here," he said. He accepted the envelope slowly, almost reluctantly, and removed a single folded letter. The paper had aged, but the ink remained readable. It described a confidential agreement made decades earlier between several influential families to conceal financial records inside the emergency shelter until they could safely be transferred. The final paragraph mentioned that one family had refused to honor the agreement, choosing instead to disappear with evidence that could expose everyone involved. Tessa watched Adrian finish reading. "Is that your family?" she asked softly. He remained silent for several seconds before answering. "My grandfather's name is on the last page." It was the first personal truth he had willingly shared all night. She looked back toward the shelves. "So everyone searching for you believes you know where those records are." Adrian folded the letter carefully. "They believed my family kept them. Did they?" He met her eyes. "Until tonight, I did not know the answer." The room fell quiet again. Everything Tessa had assumed about Adrian shifted in a single moment. He had not come to the motel searching for hidden evidence. He had stopped because of the storm, only to discover that his own past had been waiting beneath a place he had never visited before. Before either of them could speak again, a faint humming sound drifted through the tunnel. It grew steadily louder until the old emergency lights mounted along the ceiling flickered to life one after another, illuminating the corridor in pale amber light. Neither of them had touched a switch. Somewhere deeper beneath Cedar Pines Motel, an electrical system that should have been dead for decades had just awakened by itself. The lights had no right to work. Tessa Morgan stood motionless as the rows of amber emergency lamps continued glowing overhead, stretching deeper into the forgotten passage beneath Cedar Pines Motel. Their steady light revealed details the flashlight had hidden. Fresh footprints crossed the dusty concrete floor, leading beyond the archive room toward another corridor that did not appear on the original blueprint. Adrian Bellini slowly folded the letter bearing his family name and placed it inside the waterproof sleeve with the flash drive. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt as though the tunnel itself had been waiting for witnesses. Tessa looked back at the shelves lining the archive room. Thousands of forgotten pages filled dusty binders, maintenance logs, county reports, engineering sketches, and emergency planning documents. Decades of history had survived beneath the motel, while the world above quietly moved on. Someone protected all of this, she whispered. Adrian nodded, not because it was valuable by itself, because the truth inside it could not be replaced. Together they followed the fresh footprints beyond the archive. The hidden corridor narrowed before opening into a small mechanical chamber where aging electrical panels continued humming with surprising strength. Thick cables disappeared into the ceiling, feeding the emergency lights that had somehow remained functional after all these years. Tessa studied the equipment. Most of it looked older than she was, yet everything had been carefully maintained. Dust covered the floor, but the switches and control boxes had been cleaned recently. Whoever had visited this place had never intended to abandon it completely. What she did not know was that the unknown observers above ground had already realized Adrian had discovered the underground archive. They had stopped searching the motel because they believed the final answer would soon emerge on its own. Adrian examined a faded maintenance diagram mounted beside the electrical panel. One handwritten note caught his attention. Auxiliary power activates when master cabinet opens. He looked around the room until his eyes settled on a waist-high steel cabinet standing against the far wall. Unlike everything else underground, the cabinet carried a newer lock. Tessa watched him carefully test the handle. It was already unlocked. Inside rested a single leather document case protected inside a transparent waterproof cover. No money, no jewels, no mysterious weapon, only papers. Adrian removed the case with surprising care and placed it on the nearby workbench. The leather had cracked with age, but the clasp opened smoothly. Inside lay a collection of notarized agreements, property transfers, personals, and financial records dating back more than 30 years. Tessa recognized several county seals stamped across the pages. They were authentic public documents. Adrian quietly read the first few pages before letting out the slowest breath she had heard from him all night. The records were never hidden to protect one family, he said. They were hidden to protect every innocent family from a lie. Tessa stepped closer. The documents described how several powerful business partners had secretly blamed one family for financial crimes actually committed by a single trusted accountant who disappeared before the investigation ended. Public suspicion survived for decades because the evidence proving the truth vanished with the emergency archive before authorities could verify it. Adrian turned another page until he reached the final notarized statement. His grandfather's signature appeared beside 3 others. None of them admitted guilt. Instead, they pledged to keep the documents hidden until everyone directly responsible had either confessed or passed away, believing that exposing the truth too early would place their children in unnecessary danger. Tessa slowly lowered the pages. Your family was protecting evidence, not hiding from it. Adrian gave a quiet nod. The people searching for these records believed my family stole them. In reality, none of us even knew where they had been placed. For the first time since arriving at the motel, the distance between them seemed to disappear. Tessa no longer saw a mysterious traveler surrounded by unanswered questions. She saw a man carrying the weight of a story he had inherited without ever being allowed to read its final chapter. She smiled softly. You finally have the truth. Adrian looked at the aging papers before answering. Because you opened the right door. The words settled gently between them. Outside the tunnel, faint morning light had begun filtering through the old ventilation shafts. Replacing the cold darkness with the first hints of dawn, they carefully returned every document to the leather case except the notarized statement and the original county records needed to verify the archive. Those would finally leave the tunnel after decades underground. As they climbed the hidden staircase back toward the laundry room, Tessa glanced one last time into the quiet passage. It no longer felt mysterious, it felt complete. When they stepped into the motel, the first rays of sunrise touched the front windows. The storm had passed. The parking lot stood completely empty. Every unfamiliar vehicle had disappeared during the night without leaving a single trace behind. Then the motel telephone rang one final time. Tessa answered calmly. A warm, elderly voice spoke only one sentence before the line quietly disconnected. "Thank you for finishing what we could not." Sunrise arrived so quietly that it almost felt respectful. Golden light slipped through the motel windows, replacing the cold glow of fluorescent bulbs that had carried Tessa Morgan through the longest night of her life. The ringing telephone had fallen silent again, leaving only the gentle hum of the coffee machine and the distant sound of water dripping from the roof after the storm. She slowly placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The voice had sounded sincere. There had been no threat, no warning, only gratitude. Adrian Bellini stood beside the front window, watching the first cars return to the highway as though the world outside had resumed without ever knowing what had happened beneath the motel. The leather document case rested on the reception counter beside the old blueprint and the waterproof sleeve containing the flash drive. For the first time since he had arrived, he looked less like someone preparing to leave and more like someone deciding what kind of future should begin after the truth had finally been uncovered. Tessa poured 2 fresh cups of coffee. The familiar aroma filled the lobby, ordinary and comforting in a way that felt everything they had discovered. She handed 1 cup to Adrian. He accepted it with a quiet smile that reached his eyes this time. "You were right," she said softly. "Some nights really do change everything." He looked down at the warm paper cup before answering. "I was wrong about something too." She tilted her head slightly. "What was that?" He looked around the aging motel with its faded wallpaper, worn reception desk, and flickering neon sign that had somehow survived another storm. "I believed this was only a place to hide until morning." His gaze returned to hers. "It became the place where I finally stopped running from questions I inherited." The words settled gently between them. Tessa realized she had spent the entire night trying to understand the stranger who had checked into room 12. Somewhere along the way, that stranger had become someone who silenced no longer felt distant. It felt honest. What she did not know was that several miles away, the people who had spent years searching for the hidden archive quietly abandoned their investigation before sunrise. Once verified copies of the county records reached the proper authorities, the mystery that had driven decades of suspicion no longer belonged to any single family. It belonged to history. Back inside Cedar Pines Motel, Adrian carefully organized every document into 3 separate folders. The notarized county records would be delivered to the courthouse. The personal family letters would remain with the descendants whose names appeared inside them. The maintenance journals and historical materials would stay with the motel because they belonged to the property itself. Tessa watched him work with remarkable patience. There was no triumph in his expression, no celebration, only relief. She realized that the greatest victories rarely looked dramatic. Sometimes they looked like a man quietly returning forgotten truths to the people who had been waiting for them without even knowing it. A familiar pickup truck finally pulled into the parking lot. The motel owner stepped out, looking confused by the missing storm clouds and the unusually early lights inside the office. Before he could ask why both employees looked exhausted, Tessa simply smiled and said the night had been much busier than anyone expected. It was not a lie. It simply was not the whole story. Adrian politely greeted the older man before placing a sealed envelope onto the reception counter. "There are historical documents connected to this property," he explained. "They deserve to remain with the motel after the official copies are processed." The owner looked puzzled but accepted the envelope with genuine appreciation. "My father always said this place had stories nobody remembered anymore," he murmured. Maybe he was right. Tessa glanced toward the hallway leading to room 8 and the hidden staircase beyond the laundry room. She suddenly understood why her own father had never spoken about the underground shelter. Perhaps he truly had never known. Or perhaps previous generations believed some stories could only be told after enough time had passed. Outside, the maintenance crew arrived to inspect minor storm damage around the property. The old neon sign finally stopped flickering after an electrician replaced a worn connection. Bright red letters glowed steadily for the first time in years. Guests would never notice the difference, but Tessa did. She noticed every small change now. Adrian picked up his overnight bag from room 12 before returning the brass key to the reception desk. He placed it gently into her hand instead of leaving it on the counter. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "For checking into the wrong motel?" A quiet laugh escaped him. "For opening the right door." Neither of them hurried to say goodbye. Some moments became stronger when left simple. As Adrian stepped toward the entrance, Tessa noticed the morning sunlight reflecting across the wet pavement where the mysterious vehicles had once appeared during the storm. Nothing remained except clean asphalt, fresh air, and the peaceful sounds of an ordinary Pennsylvania morning. She finally understood that courage did not always arrive wearing confidence. Sometimes it arrived disguised as kindness offered to a stranger when every reason suggested turning away. And sometimes that single choice became the reason an entire chapter of forgotten history finally found its way back into the light. Some places keep memories long after the people who created them have gone, and sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding a hidden room but discovering the person you become after walking back out of it. 1 week later, Cedar Pines Motel looked almost exactly as it had before the storm. The faded sign still stood beside the highway. The coffee still tasted stronger than it should. Truck drivers continued stopping for a few hours of sleep before continuing east or west. To anyone passing by, nothing had changed. Tessa Morgan knew better. She unlocked the front office every evening with the same brass keys, but each familiar sound now carried a different meaning. The creaking floorboards reminded her that history could exist beneath ordinary places. The quiet lobby reminded her that courage often arrived without announcing itself. The old family photograph had been returned to its place on the wall after the hidden newspaper clipping was carefully preserved inside a protective folder. Beside it now hung a framed copy of the county's official letter thanking Cedar Pines Motel for preserving important historical records connected to the region's emergency shelter program. The underground archive had been documented, secured, and respectfully closed after local historians completed their work. Nothing valuable remained hidden beneath the building anymore, because the truth no longer needed a hiding place. Adrian Bellini had kept his promise. Every original family document had been returned to its rightful owners. Every official record had been delivered through the proper legal channels. No dramatic headlines filled the newspapers. No public scandal followed. The truth quietly corrected decades of misunderstanding, allowing families to move forward instead of continuing arguments that should have ended long ago. That outcome mattered far more to Adrian than public recognition ever could. Tessa often found herself remembering small moments from that extraordinary night rather than the mysteries themselves. She remembered the first cup of terrible motel coffee they shared in silence. She remembered the steady way he studied every unfamiliar hallway without allowing fear to control his decisions. Most of all, she remembered the moment he admitted that he had spent years carrying questions someone else had left behind. Those were not the words of a powerful man, they were the words of someone finally ready to become free. What she did not know was that Adrian had postponed several important meetings during the following week for one simple reason. Before making any decision about his future, there was one place he wanted to visit again without rain, without fear, and without secrets standing between him and the front door. Late one quiet afternoon, the familiar sound of tires rolling across gravel drew Tessa's attention away from the registration book. She looked through the front window and smiled before she even realized she was smiling. The same dark sedan came to a gentle stop beneath the now steady neon sign. Adrian stepped out carrying no overnight bag this time. He walked into the lobby wearing the same calm expression she remembered, although something about it had changed. The guarded distance she had first noticed on that stormy night had disappeared. "Do you have a vacancy?" he asked with the faintest hint of humor. Tessa folded her arms and looked toward the nearly empty parking lot. "I think we can find you a room." He smiled fully this time. "Good, I was hoping you would say that." They sat together on the wooden bench outside the office as evening sunlight painted the surrounding hills in shades of gold instead of gray. There was no urgency left between them. No mysterious envelopes, no anonymous phone calls, no hidden passages waiting beneath their feet. They spoke about ordinary things. Her father had begun physical therapy again. The motel owner planned to restore the old sign instead of replacing it. Adrian had decided to create a historical foundation that would preserve forgotten local stories before they disappeared forever. The conversation moved naturally, interrupted only by passing cars and the distant song of birds returning after the storm season. Tessa realized that the quiet moments felt richer than the dramatic ones because they had been earned. As dusk settled over the highway, Adrian stood and looked toward the old motel one last time before turning back to her. "That night I thought I was checking into a place to escape the weather," he said softly. "Instead, I found the place that reminded me where I wanted to belong." Tessa reached into the reception drawer and picked up the worn brass key to room 12. She placed it gently into his hand, not because he needed a room, but because some objects became symbols after enough truth had passed through them. "Keep it," she said, "so you always remember how the story really began." He looked at the weathered key, then back at her with quiet gratitude. Neither of them rushed the moment. The setting sun reflected across the motel windows while the restored neon sign glowed steadily above them without flickering once. Cars continued traveling the highway, unaware that one ordinary roadside motel had quietly changed two lives forever. The night that had begun with loneliness ended with belonging. The place that had once offered only temporary shelter had become the place where hidden history found its voice. Old burdens found their ending, and two strangers discovered that the strongest foundations were never built beneath the ground, but within the people willing to choose trust over fear. As darkness gently returned to Cedar Pines Motel, the lobby lights shone warmly through the front windows, welcoming travelers exactly as they always had, except now one woman no longer waited for the night to end. She had already found the dawn.